It's very generous of you.
Are you suing the Southern Poverty Law Center? Is that what's going on?
Yeah. I, in fact, have an update for everybody because, we crowdfunded a lot of the early costs for the case against the Southern Poverty Law Center.
What did they do? What is it? What is it
let me
based
back
on?
up a bit.
Please.
Once upon a time, yours truly, a British Muslim of Pakistani origin, was listed in the United Kingdom on the Thomson Reuters World Check database under a category red terrorism designation, while at the same time being listed across the Atlantic in the United States by the Southern Poverty Law Center as an anti-Muslim extremist. So I was both a Muslim terrorist and an anti-Muslim extremist, according to two separate lists. And of course, that speaks to some of the polarization in our times, in how irrational this conversation around extremism, Islam, integration, Muslims in the West has become. I sued Thomson Reuters World Check, the database. This database is no joke. It's like HSBC and many, many other banks use this database for background checks on whether clients can have a bank account with them. So as a result of, for example, Thomson Reuters and their database, Quilliam, which is a counter-extremism organization I founded 10 years ago, had its bank account shut down in the United States because of the Thomson Reuters World Check database system that HSBC subscribes to. Anyway, we sued them. They paid damages. They issued an apology, and they took my name off this terrorism designation list they have on their World Check database.
Maajid, I think maybe you should back up further and just give your short form bio in terms of why would you ever be on a terrorist watch list?
I'll do that. But at the same time, the Southern Poverty Law Center had listed me, as I said, as an anti-Muslim extremist. So we are also taking legal action against them. And I will get to your point, but I think just want to say that I've just held a law firm on retainer, Claire Locke, and they were the ones that sued the Rolling Stone magazine for that college campus rape scandal. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Successfully won that case. Claire Locke, which is an announcement made here exclusively with you. No one else knows this yet. We have retained Claire Locke. They are writing to the Southern Poverty Law Center as we speak. I think they've got wind of it, the Southern Poverty Law Center. As of, I think, either yesterday or the day before, they've removed the entire list that's been up there for 2 years.
Oh, nice.
They've removed the entire list, which also had Ayaan Hirsi Ali on it. And it's no longer available on their website.
Now, is there logic that if you're a critic of Islam, of radical fundamentalist Islam, that you are somehow or another a racist extremist?
So that's pretty much what they've said. If you criticize Islam, Ayaan, myself, who have come from within the community,
Yes.
who've had that experience, that somehow that makes us anti-Muslim. There are a number of logical errors involved in that logical leap that they've made.
Do they have any distinction? Is there anything that they write that sort of points to why they would say that?
One of them, honestly, the reasons they listed, one of them was that I had a bachelor party in a strip club a year before I got married.
That makes you an anti-Muslim extremist?
That was one of the reasons listed.
Why?
Well, the 9/11 hijackers were in a strip club on 9/10, right?
So
They really listed that?
They actually listed that, which is part of the reason why we can prove malice, because what has that got to do with anything?
But that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So that was a primary reason?
It was one of the three main reasons they
What are the other
originally
two?
listed. And another one was, again, false. They claimed that I had called for the criminalization of the face veil for Muslim women in the West, which wasn't true. I had called for a policy to be adopted where in banks and airports where you are not allowed to wear a motorcycle helmet, you also shouldn't be allowed to cover your face in the name of religion, which is very different to calling for the criminalization per se of the face veil. That's like saying you're not allowed to wear a motorcycle helmet in a bank, so I believe in the criminalization of motorcycle helmets. It's just absurd.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
So it was a mischaracterization of my opinion. The article.
That's two.
Yep, and the other one, the reason I can't even remember, because they kept changing their reasons. The actual website has been. We've got the archive, and they've been changing it each time people have been pointing out the stupidity of their allegations.
So why do they exist? What is the Southern Poverty Law Center's?
I mean, this is a painful irony because if you roll back the clock now, 20 or some odd years, their reasons to exist were great. I mean, this was the flagship organization that was suing the KKK and sovereign citizens and just the far right, white nationalist, Christian nationalist movements in the U.S. And in some cases to great effect, and their concern, obviously, about extremist hate groups in the U.S. was totally valid, and I mean it became. I mean now that we see how morally confused they are, people have been shining a light on them, and they're this bloated organization that's been taking in way too much money, and it's not. It suffers from other signs of corruption or conflicts of interest. But back in the day, Morris Dees was bringing the KKK to court and bankrupting their various chapters, and that looked fantastic. And now the social justice warrior, moral panic, moral stupidity virus has gotten into their brains, and they can't differentiate someone like Maajid from a right-wing Christian neo-Nazi hater of Islam, right, or hater of people from the Middle East, and so it is with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And I mean, now, ironically, you're off the website. Now I'm on it. I think I'm on it in a far more transitory way. But the article that was written about my podcast with Charles Murray by Vox hit the Southern Poverty Law Center Hate Watch page. And so there you had articles about neo-Nazi groups, articles about the Austin bomber, and then me and my podcast with Charles Murray.
I definitely want to talk about that, but I want to give people your background first.
Sure.
The reason why you were on the list in the UK in the first place had to do with your actual background.
So I was born and raised in Essex in the United Kingdom, and I came of age in what I now refer to as the bad old days of racism in the United Kingdom. Much has changed since then for the good, but in those days there were serious cases of violent racism that I faced, hammer attacks, machete attacks by actual neo-Nazis. I mean, I've grown up, this is the irony of this Southern Poverty Law Center listing, I've grown up fighting neo-Nazis on the streets, and they've been attacking me with hammers and machetes because of the color of my skin. And you've got a bunch of white guys in Alabama designating me in the same breath as they would designate these neo-Nazis. But that, when I grew up and having that experience, being falsely arrested by Essex police on a number of occasions, profiled while the genocide in Bosnia was unfolding against Muslims in Bosnia. I often say to an American audience when I'm speaking about this, we are now here with you on the West Coast in this beautiful new studio you have. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And imagine a genocide was unfolding on the East Coast against a group of people with whom you identified, and even if it's just on a human level, human beings, but even within that, a community identification would impact you in a way. For example, if you defined yourself as Jewish and there was a genocide against Jews on the other side of this very continent, of this very country, how it would impact you on the West Coast. Well, Sarajevo from London, it takes us less time to fly from London to Bosnia than it does from New York to LA. And so it really had a profound impact on Muslims across Europe when that genocide was unfolding. And things were never the same again. It radicalized an entire generation. Of course, ideology had a lot to do with that, but the anger originally came from the genocide. So at the age of 16, what with the domestic racism and the situation in Bosnia unfolding as it did, I joined Hizb ut-Tahrir, which is a non-terrorist, still legal in America and in Britain and across Europe, Islamist organization. It was the first of the global Islamist organizations that aspired to resurrect the notion of a caliphate, which we've subsequently seen to great damaging effect in the form of ISIS caliphate. And their method of coming to power was by infiltrating militaries in Muslim-majority countries, recruiting army officers, and then instigating military coups, whether that be in Turkey, in Pakistan, in Egypt. These are the countries they targeted. And their aim would be to then, through the military coup, set up this caliphate, which would then be an expansionist caliphate and would conquer the world. I mean, it sounds crazy. That's what they believe, and that's what they're very, very serious and intent on bringing about. And now people, when I say that, believe me, because they've seen the ISIS experiment unfold. But I joined a group that sought to do that through non-terroristic means at the age of 16. I ended up on the leadership of that organization in the UK. Ended up co-founding that group in Pakistan in 1999, where I left the UK, went to Pakistan, was among the vanguard of British Pakistani members that went out there to set the group up. There have been about 3 or 4 coup plots in Pakistan since, and army officers have been arrested for being members of this group, and many of them still in jail. I spent a year in Pakistan, went back while studying for my degree in the University of London. Would fly on Saturdays and Sundays to Copenhagen in Denmark. I co-founded the Danish-Pakistani chapter of this group. And then the third year of my degree, because I was doing law and Arabic, resulted in me having to go to an Arab country for the language year. And so I chose Egypt, and a day before the 9/11 attacks in 2001, I ended up in Egypt. I went to Alexandria, enrolled in the University of Alexandria to study for the year of Arabic language, which was the third year of my degree. Of course, 9/11 happened, and the climate changed, the security climate changed all over the world, something we didn't know about nor predicted. And on the 1st of April 2002, my house in Alexandria was raided by the Egyptian state security. I was blindfolded. My hands were tied behind my back. I was then driven through the desert into Cairo to the dungeon of the state security headquarters in a building known as Al-Jihaz, which was the main headquarters of Aman ad-Dawla, the internal state security. We were held in the dungeons there for 4 days, and they electrocuted most of the prisoners that they had there, tortured them, interrogated them. On the fourth day, I was taken to a prison known as Mazra'at Tora in Cairo, put into solitary confinement for about 3.5 months, then charged, eventually sentenced to 5 years as a political prisoner under the Egyptian emergency law, and served my full sentence there in Egypt. Eventually left prison in 2006 and returned to the UK.
So did Amnesty International get you out at all, or they just
No, they only
took an interest in you
so
when
they
you were coming
campaigned
out?
for my release. And nobody got me out because I had to finish my full prison sentence.
Right.
But what changed me and led to me to be the man that sits before you today is, you're right, Sam, Amnesty's adoption of me and a few others in the case as prisoners of conscience. And they took the very brave and bold step, now looking back at it, because keep in mind the context there. This is Bush was president, Tony Blair was prime minister, and we were in the thick of the war on terror. We were in the middle of it. And Amnesty comes along and says, we disagree with everything this guy stands for, but they don't believe in using violence to bring their caliphate about, and so we will defend their right to say stupid things. And they shouldn't be in prison. They certainly shouldn't have been tortured for it. So Amnesty adopted us as prisoners of conscience, and I was 24 years old at the time, by the way. So everything I've just described to you happened to me up until the age of 24 when I was imprisoned. And it was the first time in my relatively young life, I'm 40 now, right? And I had never been defended by any mainstream pillar of mainstream society in that way before. Nobody had spoken out for me, and that had a real huge kind of emotional impact on my psyche. I've said in my autobiography that where the heart leads, the mind can follow. And so I was now willing to consider alternatives because of Amnesty's work campaigning for me. And so I spent the next 4 years in prison rereading Orwell, every one of his books, reading Tolkien, reading classic English literature, studying Islamic theology, really trying to understand the world around me. And I had 4 years to do so. And I spent 4 years debating and discussing with pretty much the founders of Egypt's main jihadist organizations who were in jail with me in this same prison, including the assassins of the former president, Anwar Sadat, who had been killed in 1981 because of his peace deal with Israel. And his assassins were in jail with me. And they'd been in prison longer than I'd been alive. And so they had some collective years of wisdom between them. And most of those jihadist prisoners I was in jail with had, over the course of those years, 2 decades and more, changed their views and reformed. They were still conservative religious Muslims, something which I'm not, and I don't claim to be in my work at the moment. But they were still religious Muslims, but they were no longer extremists, and they were no longer what I call Islamists, people that sought to implement their version of Islam over society. And so they, in 4 years of constant debate and discussion with them, people that I knew had more wisdom than me, they'd been in jail for longer than I'd been alive. My views began slowly changing. I read a lot of the books they wrote about changing their own views and why they changed. And upon my release, I eventually, a good few months after my release, I had to leave the organization because I no longer believed in an ideology that I was once prepared to die for.
That is fascinating that the shift came about in jail, speaking with assassins.
Yeah, among many others, yeah.
That is really incredible. You would think that most people think that when someone goes to jail, usually whatever criminality that they have in them is cemented and hardened.
Yeah, I don't know why mine is an exceptional case, because most people, you're right. Whether you look at Sayyid Qutb, who's known as the founding father of modern-day jihadism, he started off like me, a non-terrorist Islamist, but in Egypt's jails, in fact, the very jail I was held in, he was tortured, and he ended up becoming the godfather of modern-day terrorism. through his book Milestones, or Ma'alim fi Tariq in Arabic. And yet, that in my case, for whatever reason, I kind of went that bit further to question everything I believed in. But that's not normal. In most cases, when you torture people in jail, it ends up hardening and ossifying that ideology, and people become as angry as, they become the monster that they were seeking to defeat.
So you get out of jail. What do you do then?
So I left the group in 2007, and by 2008 in January, so I finished my degree. I had 1 year left of my undergraduate degree. I graduated. I did my master's at the London School of Economics in political theory, and while doing the master's, set up Quilliam. And Quilliam, we bill as the world's first counter-extremism organization. It was meant to be, we believe it is, bringing us back to the SPLC's allegation, a Muslim response to extremism from people that have lived it and been through it. My co-founders were Islamists themselves who'd changed like me. Muslims, born and raised, come from the community to have a community-based response, a Muslim response to this growing problem of extremism. And this was 10 years ago. And of course, ISIS emerged since then, only demonstrating why this kind of response was needed. And so for the Southern Poverty Law Center to designate somebody with my background, with that trajectory, with somebody who was prepared to die for this cause, and so somebody who wanted to address these problems as a Muslim, to call for reform for the good of my communities as opposed to against them. At the end of the day, it can only benefit Muslim communities if extremism is put back in its box. For them to then list someone like me as an anti-Muslim extremist, it just really does, I think, shine a light on the true absurdity of the situation we find ourselves in.
Absurdity and the lack of real investigation or backing up their claims with actual facts and information. And that brings me to your story with Charles Murray and Vox and Ezra Klein.
Well, let's linger here for a moment.
Sure.
It's the same problem, but not only is it a lack of investigation, but when it gets pointed out, I forgot the guy's name at the SPLC who was quarterbacking this, but it wasn't Morris Dees, but it was someone high up. Mark Podek, or
the CEO, something Cohen, I think, is the.
I thought it was Mark. Anyways, he's listed he's named in the Atlantic article that first put this on our radar, but they just double down. The error cannot be pointed out clearly enough to trigger, much less an apology, any modulation of the claim. People just double down in the face of obvious counter evidence, and it's just not about a sincere engagement with the problem. And there's so many variables here that make it a really toxic environment. But one is that the locus of concern is never the individual, it is the group, it's the tribe. And so it's like they'll sacrifice any number of individuals to make the political case they want to make. So they're completely unrepentant when they're shown to get it wrong. And so in your case and in Ayan's case, it's just such a grievous moral lapse, because not only is the attack on you illegitimate, it actually raises your security concerns. And it becomes a reference point for journalists who are confused, who can't follow the plot or don't have the time to fact check everything. It makes you radioactive from the point of view of mainstream journalists,